culture knowledge. And I'm going to set the table for you a little bit, and it's just going to basically be shouted out as you hear it. But I'm going to put up on the screens a number of various families throughout the decades that perhaps have spent time in your living room, through your TV set or through movies. But all of these families share a very important common trait. And we're going to get to that at the end. But as they come up, just freely share it. Share it loud enough that I can hear it. Some of them are easier, some of them are a little bit harder. But you're naming the family name. Not the show, the family name. We got it? We got it? We're good. All right, here we go. First slide, here we go. All right, good job. We're starting off easy. Next one, here we go. The Bundys. All right, a little less. Okay, next one. Oh. The show is Malcolm in the Middle, and I believe the show aired for 6 years, but they only named the family twice. This is the beauty of Google right here. The Wilkersons. There you go. Let's get back to some easier things. This is like a great family coming up next. Here we go. Yeah, classic TV, right? All right, two more. The Connors. There we go. We have a Roseanne Barr fan over here. Okay, before we do the last one, this is probably my favorite family. I just love this family. I don't know how you can't love this family. The Griswolds, there we go, Griswolds, all those family vacations. If you've never seen Christmas Family Vacation, really recommend that movie. It's a great movie. But the common thread in all of these families is they were highly dysfunctional. And I think what they actually, the networks advertise on the fact is you could watch these families not only to get a laugh about them, but to also think, you know what? Maybe my family isn't so messed up. I'm kind of glad these are my people and I don't have like Sparky as my dad. But anyways, I always kind of remind myself of just those TV shows. Last week, we landed on the story of Abraham. And one of the things we've been doing, if you're just joining us, is we've been kind of working through the Old Testament kind of at a fairly quick pace to give us a better understanding of what God is up to in the midst of people's lives. But every week we want to kind of dive down and look at a particular situation so that we have a better understanding as to what can this teach us? How can I learn so that I may better follow God in the midst of all of life? And last week we landed on the story of Abraham. And one of the points I really hope that we got across was that oftentimes when we look at these biblical characters, we think of the incredible feats they have done and forget about their dysfunctions. Forget about their mistakes that they have committed. And what we really begin to learn as we read through the Bible is how God uses imperfect people to carry out his perfect plan. So if you've ever heard yourself saying, listen, I could never be used by God, I challenge you, read just the book of Genesis and see some of the individuals that God uses to do incredible things. Well, as you may know a little bit of the story of Abraham, God basically came to him and said, I am going to bless you and make you into a great nation. I am going to make your name great in order that others will be blessed by you. So God kind of gives him a long-range plan of, I'm going to make this great nation. I'm going to build up this community of people who are going to live life with me, but in such a different way that others will not only be blessed by it, but will take notice, and then their lifestyle will eventually point them to me. Now you could say, well, wait a second, God, is that the most efficient way to do it? Why don't you just create a nation? But as we learn, God values relationship. God values working with people, dysfunctional people, over efficiency. So he starts with one couple, Abraham and Sarah. And we know how this goes, right? To get to a nation, you have to first have a family, and then another family, and then another family, and it's going to grow, and it's going to grow, and it's going to grow. And while today we're going to jump into this family. And we're going to jump a few generations. We're going to actually look at the great grandson of Abraham. Quickly, anyone do that quick? It goes Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. There we go. We're going to land on Joseph this morning. But we made a huge leap. We're jumping multiple chapters, multiple generations in the Bible. But again, go back and read through the book of Genesis. It's a mind-blowing story of how people consistently mess up, but God never gives up on them. And God actually is using them to redeem this world. So to kind of get us going, Cliff's going to come and read us a portion of the story of Joseph.
The scripture this morning is taken from Genesis 37, verses 1 to 8. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. May God bless this reading of his holy word.
And there we begin the story of Joseph, probably very familiar to many of us, whether you have learned it in church or you've gone to the theater and seen Joseph and his Technicolor dream coat. But we begin to see, even in that passage, a dysfunction that has been handed on from generation to generation. And the dysfunction was that of favoritism. We see it right in the passage. We're told that Jacob, another name given to him by God, is Israel. So there's a little confusion. We're talking about the same guy. Jacob favored Joseph more than the others. And his brothers picked up on it. His brothers knew that their dad loved Joseph more than them. He made him a special fancy coat. He probably treated him in a way that he wouldn't treat the others. And right there off the hop, we begin to see this dysfunction just beginning to creep into this family. Well, to make matters worse, Joseph didn't really play his cards really well. He had a dream, and then he goes on to tell his brothers, "Hey, guess what? I got this great dream. You are all going to bow down and worship me." What do you think of that? I mean, how well is that going to go over? I mean, Joseph he's only 17 at the time, so maybe he wouldn't quite think it all the way through. But we're told 3 times in this passage, in a span of 8 verses, that his brothers hated him. We're told that they could not say one good thing about him. So they plot the revenge. The majority of them want to take his life. They want to murder him right on the spot. And they see him one day coming into the fields, or they're far away from home, and Joseph is approaching, and they think, all right, time for him to pay. This dreamer, this guy who thinks we're going to worship him, we're going to take him down right now. But they don't. They decide not to take his life, not out of mercy, I believe, but out of profit. They saw a band of slave traders going by, and they thought, hey, wait a second, if we just simply kill him, we're going to have no kind of pocket change. So why don't we just sell him? His life is as good as dead anyways. We'll make a little bit of money, and we'll take care of the dreamer, and life will be good again. So that's exactly what they did. They sold him into slavery for essentially a pittance, 20 shekels of silver, nothing. That was the going rate of a slave. I don't even think they even bartered on the price. They just simply said, whatever you're going to give us, take him. And then they took his cloak and they dipped it in blood, and they told his dad, sorry, Dad, Joseph is dead. Fast forward the next 13 years, and I realize I'm going quickly through this, but the story of Joseph is in Genesis 37 all the way to Genesis 50 if you want to read more about it. But for the next 13 years, Joseph then spends time as a slave. He spends time in prison. He spends 13 years probably with the ability to stew over all of that anger, that bitterness, that hurt, just getting even with what his brothers had done to him. Have you ever found yourself in a place perhaps similar, where because of someone else's actions, you have had to suffer the consequences? It doesn't put you in a very good frame of mind. It doesn't make you often feel well about that person. Well, for 13 years, that was the position that Joseph was in. And then finally, it seemed as if he caught a break. See, the Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the land, was having this dream, and nobody could interpret it for him. And so Joseph was brought in because he had interpreted other dreams correctly through the power of God. And through God's wisdom, Joseph was able to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. And essentially, the interpretation was this: for 7 years, there's going to be incredible abundance. The crops are going to overflow. But then, immediately following those 7 years, there'll be another 7 years of incredible famine that will cripple the land. So in the 7 good years, be wise, store up, stockpile, so that it can float you through the next 7. Well, the Pharaoh was impressed, to say the least. And he promoted Joseph from the prison to his right-hand man. Joseph now became the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. He was given the responsibility of basically playing out exactly what he said was going to happen. He was to oversee all of the abundance, all of the grain, all of the wealth that was going to be coming through. It was on him to essentially take care of the situation. Well, exactly as God had said through Joseph, it played out. 7 years of incredible abundance. And then the famine hit. And it hit hard. It not only affected Egypt, but it affected all the surrounding nations as well. Places like Canaan, where Joseph and his family were from. So over 20 years have passed, and suddenly a group of men come knocking. His brothers show up at his front door. They're in desperate need of food. And they don't recognize Joseph. I mean, why would they? 20 years had passed. They had probably figured Joseph had died years and years earlier. Looked different, spoke a different language, actually spoke to them through an interpreter, so they would have no idea. But Joseph knew exactly who they were. He had them lined up in his sights. The second most powerful man in the nation, with exactly what they needed. Talk about time to pay the piper. Talk about a Hollywood script that couldn't be played out any better. See, I'd love to build a climax a little bit more, but you probably know how the story goes, so I'm just going to stop it right there. Joseph acts in such a way that we almost wouldn't expect if we're truly being honest. Because instead of revenge, instead of exacting power, he offers forgiveness. He shows them grace and he gives them mercy. He not only provides for them, he eventually says, go and get Dad. Tell him that I am alive, and then bring him back, and all of you live with me here in Egypt, and I will take care of you. And we can fall into the trap of thinking, okay, I know I'm reading from the Bible, and I know that this is the way the story is supposed to go. But don't we want to give ourselves at least a moment to say, really? Doesn't it say somewhere in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Where is that in the story of Joseph? I mean, it's fascinating that we live in a society that actually looks at this story and thinks, really? I mean, I read a bumper sticker recently that says, I don't get mad, I get even. We have television shows that are actually entitled Revenge. We see so often the main characters enacting and living out a reality of if someone hurts me, I am going to make it my life's mission to get even. They will pay for what they have done. The message of forgiveness doesn't get a whole lot of play in many ways. And yet this is what we see happening in the story of Joseph. And what I'm struck by this reality is how life is so often about choices we make. Ultimately, I believe the biggest choice we make is whether or not we are going to follow God in life. Of ultimately whether or not the teachings and the instructions that he gives to us through ultimately the life of Jesus is going to be the standard with which we live. Or will we do it on our own? You see, what's interesting in this story is there's certain things that Joseph had absolutely no control over. He had little control over the fact that his dad was going to favor him above all the others. He had very little control as to how his brothers were going to respond and to sell him into slavery. And we see time and time again, he had little control over being put in jail and spending 13 years of suffering. But Joseph did have a choice. He had ultimate control over how he was going to respond to his brothers. Put everything else aside, he had control over that. Now, I know for all of us sitting here this morning, we have all been hurt to a greater or lesser degree. Likely by people who too often we are closest with. And at no point do I want to diminish the hurt or to simply kind of placate it over and just say it's not that big a deal, just kind of get up and move on. But we do want to stare into those places, to look into those relationships and say, how does what I believe influence my behavior? You see, we can say all the right things about Jesus. We can say all the right things about who he is and what he has done and how we believe, but at the end of the day, is it making a difference in our life? And as I think of this issue, particularly of forgiveness, it lands on two words that I kind of run through my mind. Can't or won't. You see, we may find ourselves in situations where someone has hurt us and hurt us dearly, and we say, I can't forgive them. But do we actually mean we can't or we won't give up the hurt? We won't give up the anger. We won't give up this sense of resentment and bitterness. You see, we don't want to phrase it that way because that's just too ugly. So we say, I can't forgive. It's beyond my ability. But as we look back into the example of Joseph, but more importantly, into the other places where Jesus not only lives it but teaches it, we see over and over again, there is no fine print when God says, forgive those who have hurt you. There's no disclaimer in terms of except in these circumstances. It seems rather straightforward for us. So how do we forgive? How do we forgive in such a way that it's not simply something we believe in, but a behavior by which we live? Because one of the lessons that I have learned in my own life is that forgiveness is a wonderful idea until I have somebody to forgive. Because that's when it gets hard. And as I look into the example of Joseph, as I look into other places in Scripture, I realize that we become people who are able to forgive not when we simply wait around and feel like it. You know, too often we think of this idea of love as being an emotion, as being something that can come and then something that can go. And we even use it in our language. We like fall into love. The Bible doesn't talk about falling into love. It talks about leading love. It talks about love as being an act of commitment, a sense of will. I love the way that Bruxy Cavey, a pastor in Oakville, says. He says, love is not about doing what makes us feel good. It's doing good regardless of how we feel. See, too often we think of love as simply being, well, if it makes me feel good and the other person's going to feel good and I'm just going to love loving them. Jesus says, you know what? Love is doing the right thing even when you don't feel like doing it in the first place. In order to become a person who forgives it also means that it's not about simply trying harder. It's not about sitting there thinking, okay, this is on me. I'm going to forgive. I'm going to forgive. Because on our own, I don't think it works. Terry Wardle says that in order for a hurt to be healed, it has to be transferred. You see, if we simply try to respond to the hurt or we try to respond to the person, likely what's going to happen is it's like pouring gasoline on a fire. It just escalates and gets worse and the emotions become more intense. So we're told we need to transfer the hurt to another. And that's what I see particularly in the story of Joseph. Very subtly, as you read through his story in chapter 37 all the way to chapter 50 in the book of Genesis, we see time and time again how Joseph references the presence of God being with him. So clearly God was at work. But then there is this one passage in the Bible, in Genesis 41, verse 51. And one of the things we need to understand is that so often the names that are given in the Bible have incredible significance, oftentimes signifying a specific situation in life. And in Genesis 41, we're told that Joseph has two boys, and the oldest boy he names Manasseh. And we think of one of those words, if you ever read through the book of Genesis, and Cliff, you did a great job on reading those names this morning. That's why I have other people read Scripture, because I can't say them very well. But you can oftentimes come across these words that are hard to pronounce, and you just kind of skip through them and go on. But there's always great significance, often always great significance with the names in the Bible. And there's this one particular name, Manasseh, that Joseph gives to his oldest son. And Manasseh is the reality of what was going on. Manasseh in the Hebrew means God has caused me to forget. God has caused me to forget. Now we could look at that and think, well, that's a nice statement. Did Joseph suffer amnesia at one point? Like, what exactly is he talking about? But he goes on to say, God has caused me to forget essentially all that has gone wrong with his family. Now we can look at that and say, well, wait a second. Does that mean that he was able to forgive because he forgot everything that happened? And so often we hear this buzz line of, you just got to get over it. You got to forgive and you got to forget. But I don't know about you, but that doesn't work. Because even though you want to go into the process of forgiving another, you can't erase and reset your memory to forget what had happened. And we see that wasn't the case with Joseph, because later on, he has conversations with his brothers about exactly what they did. Towards the very end, they are incredibly nervous because now that Jacob has died, their dad, that now Joseph is going to exact revenge. But that wasn't the case. What I believe Joseph is getting at is that when he speaks of forgetting, of God allowing him to forget, he's essentially saying, God has taken something away. And to get more specific, God has taken away my hurt, my pain, my bitterness, my desire to exact revenge. By Joseph naming his child Manasseh, he is recognizing that the process of forgiveness has taken place. So that even if he never sees his brothers again, he has forgiven them. Which is why when years later they appear before him, he is able to genuinely forgive. And man, does it get emotional. But because he processed his hurt with God, he was able to get to a place of forgiving. What's interesting about the story of Joseph is it not only gives us an example in which to follow. His story actually points us to the greatest act of forgiveness we'll ever see. He points us to Jesus. I mean, see the parallels and the familiarity in the two stories. Jesus was betrayed. Jesus was essentially sold as a slave for 30 pieces of silver. Jesus went to the cross. And it's upon the cross that he offered that prayer, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. And it's in the story of Joseph, it points us to an even greater reality of the forgiveness that God has given to us through Jesus Christ. We see the grace of God. We see the mercy and the love of God. And that is why we focus our attention back upon God. Because if we simply try to do it on our own, it's going to be so hard. Impossible, I believe. But when we begin to gaze upon the cross and to see what God has done for us, it begins to melt our hearts. It begins to change us and transform us. Jesus actually told a story in Matthew 18. He told a story of a man who came to a king and owed him an incredible amount of money. 17 years worth of wages. So just think quickly whatever you make and multiply that by 17. And the king says, you must pay me today. Pay up or you're going to prison. You will be punished. And the man says, King, I don't have that kind of money. I will never have that kind of money. Please have mercy upon me. And the king says, okay, I will cancel out your debt. I will forgive your debt. Then the man, probably really exuberant and excited and thinking, wow, I've gotten my life back. This is so good. He literally walks out of the king's palace, is walking down the street, and he noticed some other guy over there who owes him $10. So 17 years worth of wages and like 2 Happy Meals and a drink. That's what we're talking about. That's what the guy owes him. And he walks up to him and says, give me my $10 right now or you will be punished. The guy's like, I don't have $10. I don't have anything to give you. And he says, you're going to jail. Well, the king gets word of this. And you can just imagine what the king thought about that. Wasn't too impressed. Jesus tells us this story as an example of how we are to live. That I believe we are only able to forgive when we have seen and recognized and experienced how much we ourselves have been forgiven. Saying the Lord's Prayer is a dangerous prayer because we implicitly state, forgive us as we have forgiven others. Do we behave that way? Do we live that way? You see, forgiveness is a gift. It's a gift that is given to another because there's nothing they can do to earn it or deserve it. Essentially, you are saying, I am going to bear the cost. I am going to make the payment. You see, when I broke my dad's window, it wasn't enough for me simply to say, really sorry. Really sorry. The window was still broke. Someone had to fix it. And I couldn't. I had no money. So my dad fixed the window. That was part of the act of forgiveness. He bore the hurt. He bore the cost for my sake. And that's why forgiveness is such a gift, not only to the one who's been forgiven, but it's also a gift for those of us who forgive. If for no other reason, it's an opportunity for us to release the bitterness and the guilt and the anger that comes along with it. I love the words of John Ortberg. I put it on the sign a couple months ago, and I never mentioned it until now. But he says, bitterness is like drinking rat poison and waiting for the rat to die. If for no other reason, begin to take the steps of going back to God so that we can be released of this bitterness, to be released of this anger, to be released of that which is consuming and controlling us. Forgiveness is a release. My hope and my prayer for all of us here is that we would experience Manasseh in our life. That we would experience God removing that pain, that hurt, that desire to get even, so that we can truly live a forgiving life. God said to Abraham, I will bless you so that you will be a blessing. And one of the greatest ways that we bring the gospel into this hurting world is in being reminded of how we have been blessed so that we can then be a blessing to others. Everything that we do in life is always at a response to what God has already done for us. So I want to encourage you. I want to walk alongside you to understand it's not about trying harder. It's not about just simply waiting for the emotional appeal to come. It's taking that first step and bringing it back to God and allowing Him to give you the gift of Manasseh, the gift of being able to move on. Please stand with me as we sing together.